Hello, and welcome to Ask an Archaeologist. I'm Katie Fleming, staff member at the Phoebe A. Hearst Museum of Anthropology, and the host of today's show. Ask an Archaeologist is a series of live-streamed interviews co-hosted by the Archaeological Research Facility, or ARF, and the Phoebe A. Hearst Museum of Anthropology for Cal Week 2020. Each day at 11 and 2, we'll be interviewing a UC Berkeley affiliated archaeologist to answer audience questions. So before we get started, I'd like to say hi to our guest today. Hi, Elizabeth.
Hi, Katie.
This is Elizabeth Miner, and you're going to be able to ask your questions today and ask us questions by going to a website called Slido. And so on your computer or on your phone, navigate to sli.do and type in the event code AskARF or ASKARF, all one word, and click on join, and you can type in your question there. So we'll remind you again of this link partway through the interview. How are you doing today, Elizabeth?
I'm great, thank you.
Good, glad to have you here. Elizabeth Miner, who received her Ph.D. from UC Berkeley in the Near Eastern Studies Department, is currently a visiting assistant professor of archaeology at Wellesley College. She co-directs the Es-Selim R4 Archaeology Project in Sudan, a Kerma Period settlement site within the Northern Dongola Reach, and directs the Wellesley College Hall Archaeological Project in Massachusetts at the site of a historical dormitory fire. Both projects are community-based participatory excavations where community members are encouraged to be active collaborators in the research process. So we're so glad to have you here today, Elizabeth, and I was hoping we could start off by hearing about some of the projects you're currently working on.
Sure thing, Katie. I have some slides to share with you all.
Awesome.
We'll see some examples from Massachusetts and also from Sudan. I can tell you that it snowed today in Massachusetts. It probably did not snow in Sudan today, I'm guessing. And this is just to introduce me. If anyone has questions you think of later, you can feel free to email me at eminer@wellesley.edu. So as Katie said, I specialize in Sudanese archaeology and did my PhD at UC Berkeley and also worked at the Hearst Museum of Anthropology. And like more roles than I can list right now, because it's a great resource for students at Berkeley to be able to get different job experience, especially as work study, undergraduates, graduates, everything. I do museum-based research, especially digital humanities like 3D modeling and making games for archaeology. So here's some of my summer students from Berkeley last year. We're taking pictures to 3D model a statue of Heracles in the collection. I'm yelling at him to stay still while we take pictures because if he moves, he messes it up. And then I also do field archaeology. One of my field sites I can see from my office here at Wellesley. It's on top of a hill where a dormitory burnt down just over 100 years ago. So my students are able to go and work there during the school year and also during the summer. And then I also have a new field site in Sudan that I'll talk about more today.
Awesome.
Okay. So both of these projects are community-based participatory archaeology. So it's a newer type of model for running an archaeological project where people who live in the area still or are descendant populations are able to have an input in the actual process and research agenda and outcomes of the projects. At Berkeley, Professor Lightfoot, who I believe has either talked or is going to talk soon.
Yeah, later this week.
Yeah, he really was at the forefront of this with his Fort Ross project, and other archaeologists like Sonia Adelaide at UMass Amherst have really kind of piloted these types of projects. At Wellesley, what's interesting is that the community that we study are the students in the past, and so the students of today who do the field work are studying themselves in this interesting kind of turnover way. This project was also very much inspired by Dr. Wilkie's work, or Laurie Wilkie's work at Berkeley with the Lost Boys, the Zeta Psi house, that's the ARF building itself. And that was a great experience for me. My first field school actually was working on her project there. And so when I got to Wellesley and I heard that this building had burnt down, I said, can we dig it up? Please, your lawn is really, really nice, but I think the learning outcomes are more important. And they're very gracious. Everyone has has been very helpful in supporting the projects. So here's some of my students. We started in the fall of 2017, and I think we finished our 5th kind of mini season, including summer field schools. So students are able to learn the process of archaeology. That when you take Intro to Archaeology with me, this is part of 2 shifts over the weekend, you go to work, but a lot of students volunteer more time. And then other students who are interested, in alumni, people who work at the college or just in the area, they can volunteer too. They make sure they get safety training so they don't hurt themselves while they're working, because archaeology can be dangerous. So here's some examples. Because it's happening in a dormitory courtyard, community outreach happens immediately as students are coming in and out. They ask what we're doing, what we're finding, and we can get a lot of kind of informal input, but then we also do kind of more formal input, surveys, and events to find out what students are interested in knowing about the past. Wellesley is much more diverse today than it was 100 years ago, and so there's sort of a disjunct between how students are figuring out how they fit into the community today, and then this more privileged past, a very exclusive past, but still with some of the same kind of issues and goals. So students have told us through surveys they're very interested in learning about socioeconomic class in the past, gender identities, and kind of ethnicity and that kind of understandings of diversity. In particular with the gender identity, it's interesting because Wellesley is a historically women's college, but there's a big growing dialogue about gender inclusivity, non-binary and trans students, and this idea of siblinghood. So it's interesting to kind of have this project be a place to have dialogues about community today and community building, along with hauling rocks. I forgot to look it up. I think last season we moved like many tons of dirt. The students are surprised when I add it up for them. Okay, so this is what College Hall looked like before it burnt down, and this is what the inside of it was like. It was fancy. I know there's a site on the UC Berkeley campus also where there was a conservatory where Dr. Wilkie is also excavated, which I think also was destroyed by a fire. So it's interesting, you have these pictures of these very kind of ornate spaces that don't exist anymore, and then finding little hints of what was there. So here's some pictures from the process. So it's field archaeology and then also processing of the objects back in the lab. So here's some of my great assistants. And an example of one of the objects that we found is this brass lock that's just perfectly, it's rusted open like that, just perfectly. It's probably from a really fancy chest of drawers or maybe a door, but more likely furniture. And then, so we get this idea of kind of the ornateness of the past, but then we also get hints about people's daily life, and that's what I'm really interested in. So this is a perfectly preserved sardine can. And it's the students, this is actually like the favorite find of all the students I talked to, because students were not allowed to have food in their dorms at the time. And so somebody snuck in a sardine can. And so it's sort of this evidence of rule breaking and deviancy in a way from those sardines. So we send out surveys about these objects and also historical like archive pictures, and then ask kind of after every season we get input from current students, staff, alumni about what they want us to look at next. We've even crowdsourced where to dig. So I have a picture of the like aerial view, and then they're supposed to click on it where we should excavate next. And that's how we ended up. You can see Corinne and Lulu sifting on top of this hill that looks out over the campus. So it's set up to give students training, but also to kind of build this dialogue with them as a community and be a space for community building as well.
That's great. Can I ask you for a second a little bit about some of the differences between community-based archaeology and traditional archaeology? Like, what are the pros and cons of this kind of new approach to asking questions from your community base?
Yeah, it's something that has to be built in really from the start of the project if possible. And it does take time, it does take effort, and it does take planning in terms of how to do public outreach. That's something that I appreciated from my time at the Hearst, was working with public audiences and visitors. And basically, like your job that you have now, you're doing a wonderful job with getting community input for the curation and display of objects. So it takes time, it takes effort, and you have to be really conscientious about how you approach people, and kind of make it known that you do value their opinions and their input. In the past, archaeology would be much more top down, and and also, well, I mean, historical archaeology is very important, but when we'll see examples from Sudan and also like Egyptian archaeology, which is another thing that I specialized in at Berkeley, it's very hierarchical, and it's often foreign archaeologists coming in to study the other, and often wrapped up in colonialist systems. So it's the French were in control of the Egyptian Antiquities Service when the Egyptian collection that's at the Hearst was formed. And so in that case, it was George Reisner coming in under the auspices of Phoebe Hearst, working with those kind of the colonialist structure to get permissions, and everything at the Hearst has like very good provenance and permissions and legal background for it to be there. But it's not this more kind of like flipped or almost like grassroots type of archaeology instead.
Yeah, and it seems like the questions that are coming out of the students both are probably so much richer than a single archaeologist or a team of archaeologists could come up with on their own. And
Yeah.
also that there must be so much more, I would imagine, buy-in from the students working on this project, because they not only are doing the labor, but also the physical labor, but also the intellectual labor of trying to answer their own questions.
And then it happens together. So as you're in the unit and working and muddy and sweaty or freezing cold, excavating in the cold is actually worse. I didn't know till I tried working in Massachusetts, and it's like snows on you unexpectedly. Like at the point of the trowel, you're having those conversations and questions and discussions as things are literally coming to light, and that's really important to have it like really integrated that way.
Mm-hmm. So we're also getting a question from the audience about whether these projects at Wellesley have incorporated perspectives from the larger community or just from within the college campus.
Yeah, so that's one of the goals. One of the reasons I chose this site in particular, the hill is kind of artificially augmented. It's very landscaped. So we're not expecting to find, say, Native American remains there. And that was a conscious choice on my part, because these students they're literally starting out, and like first week of learning about archaeology, and they're also excavating. So I wanted to make sure that they were working in kind of a safe space to build those skills. So if there was the possibility of Native American like settlement or something like that, I would definitely want to bring those voices into it. And the people who live in the town themselves, there's that possibility. It's interesting. Okay, I'm gonna plug Berkeley. Like, Berkeley's a public institution, so it's really important to have that community building with the wider Bay Area. Mm-hmm. And again, I think the Hearst and ARF does that really well. Here, there's not quite as much of a direct connection, but that's something the students are very interested in pursuing. Mm-hmm. But the avenues are not quite as well set up as, say, at Berkeley. And I think it just comes down to the root difference between public and private institutions. Mm-hmm. Wellesley's a very affluent suburb of Boston, and I think people there are interested, but it's not quite the same kind of priority that like the Bay Area is looking for those spaces to come together and have those conversations.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thanks.
Okay, so I'll move on to Sudan. I have one picture from Egypt there. So at Berkeley in Near Eastern Studies, the program there concentrates on Egyptian archaeology. So from 2005 on, I've been working in Egypt at the site at El Hiba that Dr. Carol Redmount, she directs, and then also working with the Hearst Museum Egyptian collection. And then since 2013, I've done archaeology in Sudan, first with the Arizona State University Bioarchaeology of Nubia expedition run by Brenda Baker, and then research at the museum on my own, and now this new project. And it's been very interesting to see the desire of both Egyptians and Sudanese people to learn more about their historical sites and cultural patrimony in their countries. In Sudan in particular, the top left picture is taken on New Year's Day, which at the time was Sudanese Independence Day, at the site of Kerma so I've studied this for my dissertation, but it's like a big meeting point for people. It's used, there's a big festival and people come, they're standing on top of an ancient temple to kind of celebrate their kind of current kind of national pride and excitement about the new year in this ancient site. And so the site that I work at Es-Selim R4 is from the same time period. So it's really great to have this as kind of an understanding, this place that's seen as important for Sudanese history and identity, and then that is kind of a way to get into a conversation with people about the new material that we might uncover. And I've also been lucky enough to work on public outreach, again, through the ASU Bioarchaeology of Nubia expedition. It's actually very hard to not do community archaeology in Sudan because people are, hospitality is incredibly important in the country. And the site there is close to an elementary school. So students would come by on the way and home from school and stop and like be very curious about what we were doing and talking with them. And then we formalized that process more and made a pamphlet with information about the site, and did a program at local elementary schools, which was very, very rewarding. Okay, so this is Es-Selim R4. It's further out into the desert away from the Nile, but in about 4,000 or 3,000 years ago was when the site was occupied, and it's settlements that are sort of, they were islands, and this whole kind of sandy plain would have had paleo channels of the Nile snaking through it. So if you look, I think you can see my cursor on the upper right, these green areas are outlining where we can see surface evidence of settlements. And then in between them and around them were paleo channels of the Nile. It's now just very soft drifting sand. So you can imagine this was an ideal place for people to live. It was at this this point where different paleo channels were coming together, so facilitating trade in the area. And it's maybe around 10 or 12 hectares of settlement site, which is, they've been identified for this period, but not a lot of settlement sites have been excavated for this period of Nubian history. So I'm hoping the site is going to keep me busy for a long time. I've had 2 opportunities to visit there, once as part of a larger kind of survey to look at different sites that potentially were to excavate. And then last January, or this January, I guess, we were able to go and have a short survey season. So that's the team and kind of people who are involved on the lower right. So the 2 men on either end, Tariq and Qasim Al-Farah, they are both landowners for the site, and so they are involved in us meeting them and describing the project and setting up community meetings for the project. And then this is Ahmed Sokri, and so he's the inspector from the Sudanese government who we worked together previously, and he was involved in the community outreach in the ASU project also. And so he was very interested to work with me again and be that kind of also like community liaison for building relationships. Christopher Savara, formerly of the University of Vienna, now of Newcastle, is a landscape archaeologist. So he was there to work with survey, and also he does remote sensing and historical satellite imagery look at where potentially there's other sites or elements of the sites that he's seen through kind of analysis, and then see it on the ground. And then me, and then my co-director, Sarah Skellinger, is at Ohio State University. She wasn't able to come this season, but she will in the future, and she's a architecture specialist. So she's going to be the one in charge of dealing with all the mud brick that we can see evidence for on the surface of the site. And then Salah Mohammed, who is our operations manager, and worked with him before as well. So our goals for the first survey season were to map everything that we could. The yellow dots here are where we collected objects on the surface. You can see down here, diagnostic pottery to help us figure out when exactly different parts of the site were occupied, and then to do aerial photography to do get a like a 3D model or digital elevation model of the whole site, which you can see down at the bottom.
Cool.
And then of course also to make those connections in the community and find out what types of research questions they wanted us to prioritize and to kind of get them involved in the process.
Cool. So I want to remind our viewers that if you have any questions as we're talking, you can ask those questions by going to sli.do, the website Slido, sli.do, and typing in Ask ARF to join the event, and then you can ask your questions there. And so we have some questions for you now, if it's not an interruption. So it's looking very hot here. You mentioned that it's cold in Massachusetts in the winter. Are you mostly working here in the cooler months of the year or all year round?
Yeah, most archaeological work in Sudan, some people are able to go in the fall. I think basically from November to March, you're okay to work. It was actually really cold when we were there, like properly cold, 40 degrees in the morning. So that's why we're all bundled up here. But when I've worked in Sudan before, up through about April 1st, it can get very hot, like 120, even 130 degrees.
Wow.
And then there's also sandstorm season, which starts in March, and then a monsoon in the summer. So it's, yeah, the weather makes it very difficult to do archaeology there in the summer. So, but in Massachusetts, you can dig in the summer. So now I can kind of bounce back and forth.
Take turns.
Yeah.
And can you tell me a little bit about the difference between what community-based archaeology looks like in a place that's maybe a little more removed from your community when you're leading a project versus like, for example, the project you were talking about at Wellesley?
Here, let me show you the next slide.
Great.
So I think that will help. Okay, this is us doing technical stuff. And also I want to give a shout out to Saida Ahmed, who is the inspector in the previous season. She's a master's student at University of Khartoum. So it involves, again, being very conscious about how to meet people in the community and let them know about the types of work you're going to do, because this is kind of more invasive archaeology. It's not in my backyard, basically. So here on the lower right, you can see Chris, before using the drone for aerial photography, he's explaining to folks in the neighborhood what is going to happen and why we're doing it. And we've gotten police permission and local permission to do this. And we didn't know, were people going, we want to make sure that we aren't kind of overstepping our boundaries as foreign researchers. And in this case, the community, what they asked for was actually like a flyover video of them out and waving, which I found really touching. But the winds there are very high, and so there are safety considerations. We hope to be able to do that in the future, but at that day it was not really an option. And then that's where working especially with Ahmed Sokri comes in. So he's there as a governmental representative, but also a liaison with the community. So the picture on the left is the first day we were on the site, and then Ali Farah is one of the landowners who's there with us, and he one of the reasons I really appreciate working in Sudan again is hospitality, and that people there are really eager to participate and get these understandings, be involved in creating new understandings of their past. So when I visited sites and said, okay, this is a potential site, maybe next year we'll come back and excavate, people were like, marhaba, welcome, like, please come back. One guy even's like, why are you gonna wait till next year? I have a shovel in my car, we can just get started. So it's, I really appreciate this openness to working with archaeologists in this region of Sudan and Northern Dongola, but really most of the places I've worked. It's not always historically been the case, but that's why I think it's important to have projects like this to build these kind of positive case examples. Oh yeah, so we'd found these 3 sherds that all fit together. So, and then this is the first community meeting that we had, also intended by women and children in the area, but they kind of declined to be photographed for something that would be shared. So as part of the meeting, I asked, okay, these are my main research questions. What do you want me to prioritize first? And they decided as a community that they're interested in the ancient environment, which was interesting because that was what we kind of wanted to start with. So it was cool to see, like, I've often found in asking these questions that, like, there's a lot of already alignment, but kind of subtleties that come in the conversation. I asked them how they wanted me to share my research results, and the women wanted a video and the men wanted a pamphlet, and so we decided to compromise, like, yearly pamphlets, a video maybe once every couple of years. And I asked them, when I give talks about Sudan in America, what do you want me to tell people? What do you want people to know about your community? And one guy said, what you see with your own eyes is the most important. That they wanted me to talk about how great Sudanese food is, and it's amazing. And again, part of hospitality there is very important. And competitive eating is important too. So a lot of this first season was like trying to keep up with the amount of food people were giving me, which again, I'm really grateful for. And how beautiful the women's clothing is, the patterns of the fabric. And in particular, they're like, share that great picture of Ali. So that's the picture on the left.
Great. And in response to that picture, or maybe just in general, we had a question from the audience of someone who's curious what you do with the things that you find on these digs in Sudan.
Yeah, so the current setup for working with National Corporation for Antiquities and Museums, we document all of the finds and we turn in a manifest list of the objects to the governmental representatives at NCAM. And then they go through, they determine which ones they want to remain in the country, but they do allow the taking of samples and objects out of the country, but it's completely controlled by Sudanese officials themselves. This particular project at this time, everything stayed in Sudan. I kind of lean towards that in general, but it's interesting. Again, country to country, there's different rules. And in the past, with the system of partage, it was, there's a lot of inequity built into how those decisions were made. But I do feel comfortable here that it's very much well regulated and falls on the side of the Sudanese to determine what they want to keep or not. And when it leaves, it's as a permanent loan. So it's an understanding it stays as, again, cultural patrimony and belongs to Sudan.
So we only have a couple more minutes, and I think you have a few more slides with some images to share with us. So I didn't know if you want to get to those or.
Oh yeah, I'll just do it quickly.
Cool.
Oh, this is where the site is. That's important. Food. Sudanese food is amazing and eaten communally. I want to especially say garasa is the food in the upper left. It's kind of like layers of pancakes with stew inside of it, and it's delicious.
That sounds great.
And then also as part of this community building, it's interesting as a woman, as an archaeologist, there's a lot of connections maybe that get made that way. So my students were inspired. There's there's an international language of friendship bracelets, I would say. So this one, 2 young women that I stayed with previously gave to me, Aisha and Namarek. And my students loved that idea. And so they wanted to make friendship bracelets for me to take with me. So Georgia and Eileen here We had a pizza party at the end of our season, and they made them, and then here's some of the women in Es-Selim with it. And they're very excited to have that. And so I'm trying to find ways to set up these kind of exchanges of just like tokens of friendship, but also ideas of participating in archaeology. So the women there saw pictures of the students in Wachap here in Massachusetts, and we're really excited about potentials of them, like how they will help with this project in Sudan in the future. So it's something that I appreciate. It's kind of like setting up these dialogues internationally.
Nice. And we actually have one more audience question. They're curious about thinking about the sardine can that was found on campus and wondering how old something has to be considered archaeological.
That's an important question. So there's certain laws and regulations, again, that depend on where you are. In the US, I actually know more about Massachusetts. It has to be over 100 years old to be considered historical, like a historical site. But if you want to think about something archaeologically, it could be something you've just made or just consumed. To me, archaeology is more the types of questions and how you're thinking about material culture, how people made something, their intentions, how it's used, and how relationships are built through that using or making of a thing. So I don't know, as an archaeologist, like I love to rummage through secondhand stores and dumps and stuff like that, like free cycling. And so to me, it could just be immediate, but I think it's more how you think about or approach something.
Awesome. So I want to thank you so much for being here today, Elizabeth, and thank all of our viewers for submitting great questions, and invite everyone to join us for the next episode of the Ask an Archaeologist series, which is going to be today at 2 p.m. Sarah Kansa of the Archaeological Research Facility will be interviewing Michael Nyland in a talk entitled Chang'an, Counterpart to Rome and Alexandria. So I just want to thank you again, Elizabeth, and I don't know if you have a last message for our audience before we sign off for the day.
Yeah, I asked my seminar students what are the 3 things people should know about archaeology, and I almost forgot. Okay, that it's constantly evolving, that many people's viewpoints are important and valued, and things that we know now, or things that we think we know now, are always changing, and new research is always important to add to new understandings of the past.
Such good takeaways and such a good note to end on. Thank you for remembering that. And thank you to your students for sharing that. So hope you have a wonderful afternoon, and thank you for being here.
Thanks, Katie.